Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Wasatch Front Regional Council. Those of you that are here in purpose, and I'm glad everybody's been able to go ahead and get some food here. And those of you that are online, welcome as well. I hope that you that are online are also have indulged and gotten yourself some food for lunch. Unlike most Zoom meetings, this is a lunch meeting, and cameras on and eating with the camera on is totally acceptable. What I'm going to try to do here, just because this is a hybrid meeting, this is the challenge of doing hybrid meetings, is we want everybody to feel completely able to participate in the discussion that we're going to have today. And as such, we'll keep a close eye on everybody that's online here. And if you want to speak up, just do so. And if you're online and you want to raise your hand, we'll call on you. Okay, but want to try to have everybody feel able to participate. We're going to start out our meeting here today with doing introductions. We'll go around the table as a start, then to the folks that are sitting in the seats away from the table, and then we'll go online. So Trustee Aserson, will you start, please? And please speak into the microphone if you're in the room, and turn the microphone on if you're in the room.
Yeah, I'm Trustee Aserson at UTA. I hope you follow all those instructions. Thank you.
Carlton Christensen, also trustee with Utah Transit Authority.
Andrea Pearson, WFRC staff.
I'm Andrew Gruber with Wasatch Front Regional Council.
I'm Jeff Silvestrini, Mayor of Mill Creek and Chair of the Regional Council.
Bob Stevenson, Davis County Commission.
Denise Davenport, Planning and Policy Director with Mountain Land Association of Governments.
I'm Mary DiLoretto, Chief Service Development Officer at UTA.
Beth Holbrook, Trustee of UTA.
Dave McCall, Tooele City.
Ben Hewitt, UDOT Program Development Director.
Leigh Felder, Director of Legislative Affairs at UDOT.
Steve Gale, Morgan City Mayor.
Ned Hacker with the Wasatch Front Regional Council.
Miranda Jones-Cox with WFRC.
Mike Sopchak with WFRC.
Michelle Carroll, Deputy Director, MAG.
Jory Johnner, Wasatch Front Regional Council, Long Range Planning Staff.
Julie Bjornstad, Wasatch Front Long Range Planning.
I'm Peter Asplund, Deputy Director of Legislative Affairs with UDOT.
Sean Elliott, MPO Director with MAG.
Jay Aguilar, Long Range Planning Manager for UDOT.
Tyler Torres, WFRC intern.
Okay, that's everybody in the room. Now let's go online, and we're going to start down south. Myron, anybody else from your organization?
Hello, I'm Myron Lee with Dixie MPO, and I don't believe we have anything else.
Okay, and then let's go working our way up to the Utah County area. Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson with Mountain Land Association of Governments.
Okay, let's then jump up to Weber County. I see Commissioner Frohr and Mayor Berube.
Yeah, Commissioner Gage, Frohr, Weber County.
Neil Berube, Mayor, North Ogden City.
I skipped right over Salt Lake County. Tammy from Harriman.
Yes, Tammy Moody, Harriman City, Government Affairs.
Okay, great. And then let's jump up to Cache. Jeff, and anybody else from your area?
Jeff Gilbert from the Cache MPO, and I think we have Todd Buettler here from Cache Valley Transit.
Great. Now to our friends at UTA that are on with us.
Cheryl Bishop with UTA.
Michelle Larson, UTA.
Nicole Bordeaux, Chief Planning and Engagement Officer for UTA.
Okay, great. And I see Kay with the Provo, the beautiful Provo logo. That's Mayor Kafusi? That's her admin. Okay. Well, hopefully we'll have maybe the mayor's getting some food, and hopefully the mayor will be able to join us momentarily. Now, let's see, others from UDOT, Andrea?
Andrea Olson, the planning director at UDOT.
Okay, and Justin, our friends at the league.
Hey, Justin Lee, Utah League of Cities and Towns, Director of Government Relations.
Okay, and then from our partners at FHWA, Jennifer. Jennifer Elskin is with leads the division office of the Federal Highway Administration. Well, she works with the division office here in Utah with the Federal Highway Administration. And then Ryan joining us from Washington, D.C.
Hey all, Ryan Levitt, a federal consultant, and happy to be on today. I'm going to be speaking on one of the agenda items related to federal funding. So happy to be here. Thanks.
Thanks. Ryan works with WFRC and UTA and provides able service to us. So thank you very much. And our friend Muriel has joined us as well.
Hello.
Muriel Xochimil, friend to transportation. Thanks, Muriel.
Good to see you all.
Okay, did I miss anybody? I don't think I missed anybody. Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. The first thing is the approval of the minutes from our March 31st meeting. I have a motion and a second to approve, please.
Second.
Okay. All in favor, say aye. Any opposed? I should have asked for any corrections or comments on the motion. Any corrections to the minutes or comments on the motion? Too late now. Seeing none anyway. Okay. All in favor, say aye. Any opposed? Okay, approved. Okay, thank you very much. What we did in that first meeting of the year together is we talked about the thing that unifies us in the Joint Policy Advisory Committee, and that is Utah's Unified Transportation Plan. You'll remember that we laid out in that meeting the purpose of the Unified Transportation Plan, that it pulls together and identifies all of the transportation needs across the state of Utah decades out to 2050. And it identifies the needs for state roads, local roads, transit, and active transportation, biking and walking. It looks at the need to expand the capacity of our system to meet the growth, fastest growing state in the nation over the past 10 years. And it also, just as importantly, identifies the needs to preserve and maintain in a safe state of good repair the existing infrastructure that we have. That's what the unified plan is. We did a wrap up on the recently completed state legislative session. And we talked in some about the outcomes from out of Congress and the passage of the multi-year Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That's what we did at the first meeting. Today's meeting is going to have a theme, and it's focusing on transportation funding. That's what we're focusing on here today. And what we're going to do as a starting point is Julie Bjornstad from WFRC and I are going to give an overview of where we stand on transportation funding in the state. And then we're going to sort of move into what we call a policy discussion around some of the key issues, funding issues that need to be confronted on transportation as we look ahead in the decades to come. I'll say this as just as an intro, and then I should say that at the end of the meeting, we're going to shift our focus specifically to federal transportation funding, formula funding, and also how we can best compete for grant funding from the at the federal level. And then we're going to get an update on what we now call congressionally directed spending, formerly known as earmarks. Okay, so again, theme through the meeting here is talking about transportation funding. A little context before we jump right into the presentation. The context, you can pull it up on the screen though, Julie. The context is we as transportation agencies do this work in due course as part of developing Utah's Unified Transportation Plan. We evaluate needs, as I said, and we analyze the revenues that are anticipated to be available, and we make projections out over decades through Utah's Unified Transportation Plan. This is work that we do on a 4-year cycle. The current cycle is that we are anticipating adopting, collectively adopting the Unified Transportation Plan in 2023, reflecting all of our work together. Now, you have to add to that, there is also a policymaking or legislative discussion that is kicking off now about transportation funding as well. As several of you in this room know, the legislatures has a Utah's Unified Economic Opportunity Commission, which is a high-level policy body where we have the service of the governor, the speaker, and the president, representatives from the League of Cities and Towns and Association of Counties, and others coming together to look at the growth challenges of our state. There's a subcommittee of that group. It's called the Growth and Transportation Working Group. That group met just earlier this week. Trustee Acerson was there, and others were that are here on this room were there. And one of the things that is on the agenda for that working group is, in fact, talking about transportation funding as well. So the point is that we do this work in evaluating transportation funding needs as part of the Unified Transportation Plan, but also over the next 6 months or so, we're going to have an opportunity to participate in dialogue with our policymakers about what the transportation needs are and how do we address them. That 6-month schedule may accelerate a little bit the work that we're already doing together on the Unified Transportation Plan, but that Unified Plan can and should and will, I think, provide a foundation for understanding and trying to address, have policy conversations and try to address what the needs are. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take you through this presentation, and I'll tell you, we shared this with that working group on growth and transportation. And those of you that are members of the Wasatch Front Regional Council have seen some of this because we talked about this at our council meeting last week. But Julie, let's move on to the next slide. So as an overall goal in Utah's Unified Transportation Plan, and hopefully this is something that everybody would look at and say, yes, with consensus, that for transportation, we need to have long-term, stable, adequate, multimodal transportation funding. Okay, that sort of underlies the basic premise of the Unified Transportation Plan. And the Economic Opportunity Commission last year passed a motion basically supporting that principle that's stated there. Now, I mentioned already, and JPAC has an important role in the, let's go to the next slide, Julie, please, in developing Utah's Unified Transportation Plan. The transportation agencies, and I guess I should, we all know, we're all here in the room, but I'll call it out. That's the 4 metropolitan planning organizations in the state, Cache Valley MPO, Dixie MPO, Mountain Land Association of Governments, and Wasatch Front Regional Council, working with UDOT and UTA, and then also engaging the other local transit districts around the state. We put together this Unified Transportation Plan. I'll remind everybody that we are actually regarded as a national model for working collaboratively to have a unified transportation plan. The transportation agencies right now, you can see it on the screen, but I'll read it to you, are evaluating and updating transportation funding for state and local roads, transit, and active transportation, all the modes, including the adequacy of the current funding sources, those that are already in place today, in meeting the long-term needs for capacity enhancing projects and also operations and maintenance and preservation and state of good repair. Okay, we're working on that collectively. We have a unified plan finance subcommittee that is working on that with the help of financial consultants at Lewis Young. Okay, next slide, Julie. Oh, and now I'm going to turn it over to Julie, who is at the podium up here, and she's going to talk about information that is, it's actually reflective of what's in the current Unified Transportation Plan, meaning that this information is just a few years old and doesn't reflect yet all of the modifications in transportation funding, the new world we live in now. But that's where we're going to go after Julie gives an update on the current situation or current plans funding assumptions. Julie.
Yeah, so I'm just going to show you some information, like Andrew mentioned, about how the state's transportation is funded, both in the short and long term. Sorry. So what you're seeing here is in a typical year, how state roads, local roads, and transit is funded by source. So the yellow is federal funding. So this is federal formula funds that are coming, discretionary grants that we may be getting, the motor fuel tax that's coming in. The blue that you'll see is state funding. So this is motor or gas tax, vehicle registration, any state sales tax that is going towards transportation. And then the green is our local side. So local funding sources include local option sales taxes that our counties and cities are passing, general fund contributions, transit fare box, anything on the local side. So you can see at the state roads, the budget is typically about almost $1.5 billion a year that the state spends on capacity operations and preservation of the state road system. About 3/4 of that is coming from state funding sources, and about 1/4 of that is coming from federal funding sources. On the local road side, this is throughout the entire state. We spend about $640 million a year to operate our local road system. The majority of that is coming from local funding sources, but the state does contribute mostly in our B and C funds. So the portion of the gas tax that goes to our B and C class roads, and a little bit coming from federal funding, usually as passed through the MPOs and in the rural areas from UDOT and our STP funds, CMAQ, TAP funds. So those federal formula programs. And then on the transit side, to operate and maintain and expand transit throughout the state is about $540 million a year. The majority of that is coming from local funding sources, whether that's local option sales taxes or fare box recovery or advertising on buses. And then the next biggest chunk of that is coming through our federal formula programs. Like Andrew mentioned, this is a few years old, so this isn't taking into account into what's happening with TTIP over the last couple of years or any of the appropriations the state has given to transit over the last 2 legislative sessions. So that's just a brief view of how we typically fund transportation in the state. But the unified plan obviously go back.
Just pause for 1 second. Just want to see as we're going through this, if anybody has any questions or comments. And then I also want to acknowledge, we've been joined by Mayor online by Mayor Cox from Hyde Park. He's the mayor. You're the chair of the Cash MPO, if I've got that right.
Correct.
Okay, welcome, Mayor Cox. And then also Nathan Trepesky, Harriman City Manager. Thanks for joining us. And UDOT Director, Carlos Becerras. Welcome, Carlos. Thanks. Any comments? Carlton.
Are these operational funds or operational and capital? Just operational?
It's operational, maintenance, and capital. So all three.
Okay.
As we're walking through this information again, remember that where we're headed to is a discussion about transportation funding needs and how to address them as we go forward. So we're going to want to have dialogue. This is the backdrop for it. So this is one average year. Okay, Julie?
Yeah, and so the unified plan obviously looks out to 2030. So we're looking at 20 to 30 years into the future. And when we aggregate all of that up to the unified plan level throughout the entire state, this chart is showing you the amount of need there is in the state to build, maintain, and preserve operate the road, transit, and active transportation systems. You see state roads, local roads, and transit. You're not seeing that active transportation component coming out, but that's included in the state and local roads. So this is showing you the overall need we have in the state for state roads is the first bar, and then local roads and transit. The blue on the bottom is the existing revenue that we have through existing gas taxes, local option sales taxes, general fund contributions, what we are using today to fund our transportation system. That the next chart, that green bar, is what we've assumed in the unified plan might happen as far as new revenue sources. So these are additional local option sales taxes. The state, I don't know what the right legal term is, but allows communities to, opens up. How do you say that? Brings up a new local option sales tax about once a decade. The 5th quarter authorizes. Thank you. So I don't have livestock. So and then the red bars on the top is the remaining amount needed that we either don't currently have funding transportation, or we don't expect to have in the next 30 years to fund those needs. So on the state side, you can see we have about $46.1 billion of need to operate and maintain and build new state roads. The majority of that is coming from existing revenue. On the local side, we have about 26.2 billion. You can see that a lot of that is funding through existing revenue sources, but there is a greater need there in terms of the remaining amount needed. That most of that gray that's coming there is additional local option sales taxes. And then on the transit side, throughout the state is about $36.2 billion to maintain and expand and operate the transit system. And only about half of that is what we can fund through existing revenue sources. We have some planned new revenue, again, coming mostly from local option sales taxes. And then the red at the top is what we don't assume to have. And you can see that of those three transportation facility types is the most sort of unfunded or remaining amount needed. When we bring those all together, we have about $74.4 billion of existing revenue that we've identified over the next 30 years. About 16.5 billion that we've said we can reasonably expect this to come online over the next 30 years. And the remaining amount needed is still $17.6 billion to help fund not everything in the state that you can possibly dream up, but these are identified needs that have gone through a process with transportation agencies, counties, cities, and others in the state to prioritize these needs and say, this is what is important, this is what is reasonable to build in the next 30 years. So it is not the pie in the sky transportation system. We still have about 30, if I can do math on the spot, about $35 billion worth of sort of missing revenue over what we have today. Andrew.
Okay, so this is meant to be given order of magnitude understanding of what our overall financial picture is in the state. We're rounding to the nearest $100 million, but even with that rounding, when you look out over a 30-year period, there is necessarily a degree of imprecision in what the exact needs and costs are and what the revenues are. But this kind of analysis is meant to give us and policymakers a sense of the direction that we need to consider as we try to plan for the future. One of the reasons that Utah's economy is thriving now is because for decades in the past, there's been great planning and investment in transportation. And so we do this type of work to try to identify what are the key needs going forward and are we going to be able to meet them? And so we're in the process now, as we just said a few minutes ago, of updating all of this information, okay? It's critical, I think, to note that if we do nothing, if all the funding sources that are in place right now stay in place, but we don't add anything to that, we would only, and I'm putting only in quotes because it's significant investment, be able to do the $74 billion of investments. So that leaves out significant additional needs in state roads and particularly local roads and transit, including active transportation. The Unified Transportation Plan identifies those highest priority investments. That's the 16.5 billion. And then even beyond that, there are other needs that have been identified, as Julie is saying, but we don't presume that the revenues will just appear to cover all of those needs, but we still identify what those needs are even on top of that. I just don't want anybody to get confused to think, oh, well, we've got the 16.5 billion covered already. We have to have significant decisions and actions to get to that, let alone to the remaining 17.6. Carlos.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And I think the reason you're doing this is you're trying to help us understand how we did it for the last long range plan. And these numbers are specific to the last long range plan. We're still in the process of determining what those needs are for this next phase, this next update of the long range plan. So we're talking about the numbers, but those numbers are going to change, and the total amount of needs is going to change. And so true?
Yes.
So I don't want
excellent.
us to get too hung up on the actual numbers here.
No, it's a great point. Commissioner Stevenson, I'll go to you in just one sec. What we're showing you now is what's in the currently adopted Unified Transportation Plan. Back up for one sec, Julie. And then what we're in the process of doing now, as Carlos is noting, is figuring out, all of us together, many of the people in this room and online, working together to update what the needs are, project needs, and then also update the revenue picture. So that's the work we are engaged in now. This sets the framework for where we're at today in the unified plan, but we're working on that. Commissioner Stevenson.
Yeah, Carlos, I'm kind of curious, if we go back, say, 5 or 10 years ago and look at where we were at this time, and again, we're always going to be in a sense behind. Are we catching up at all? I mean, with what we see here, how would you?
I made this statement earlier this week to a body that I'm not sure what the reaction was. Jeff was there. If we're able to do everything we've identified that we need to do, we're still gonna, what's gonna change is we are gonna have more congestion. And that's a piece I think a lot of people haven't realized, is that we're not gonna, if the word catch up or fall behind means, will I spend more time in traffic? You will spend more time in traffic if we do all the projects identified. And that's just the reality of where we're at. I'd like to say, if we're gonna come close to doubling our population, we're not gonna double the lane miles. Even with every project shown in the long range plan, we're not doubling the lane miles. And so things are gonna change. That's why transit's so important. That's why active transportation is so important.
Carlton.
Andrew, in these numbers, because I know it doesn't fall into the RTP, does local bus service flow into the unified transportation numbers?
Yeah, that's a great question, Carlton. And the answer is yes, from a financial perspective. So the numbers that we use in the Unified Transportation Plan are comprehensive for major capital projects, minor capital projects, service operations. The Unified Transportation Plan does not display every local bus route. It doesn't display every resurfacing of a local road, but the financial assumptions, generally speaking, incorporate all of those needs. Okay. Now, the changes. So since all of that, since all of the numbers that we were just talking about, and we all know this, many things have happened, many things have changed. This is just a short list of some of the significant recent impacts. Over the past 2 years, the state legislature has appropriated in one-time funding over $2 billion to transportation. The majority of that is going for state road projects that are programmed by the prioritized and programmed by the State Transportation Commission with the able help of the UDOT staff and Ben Hewitt in particular. Thanks, Ben. And for 4 projects, I will note 4 projects that are in Utah's Unified Transportation Plan, mainly in the first phase of that Unified Transportation Plan. That's terrific. And as our friends at UTA know, programming, or the state has appropriated money for the first time to transit projects as well, and to active transportation. So I just want to make a note, for particularly for those of us that have been doing this for a while on the Unified Transportation Plan, the state now is utilizing the principles and the plan, the Unified Transportation Plan, more than ever before in terms of the funding and the decision-making. I think we should all be really pleased about that fact. So that $2 billion, in essence, the 16.5 billion slice that we had on the page, on the slide before, that would effectively be a takedown on that shortfall. It goes against that shortfall number. In addition, the federal government passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is providing in formula funding, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, an additional approximately $500 million beyond what we were previously assuming we would be getting as a state. $500 million more over the next 5 years. And then you can basically extrapolate that out over the length of the 30-year plan. You can't just multiply it by 6. The lines come together. So it's not a direct multiplication by or extrapolation, but we can assume maybe that we'll have funding, increased funding beyond what we anticipated from the federal government. At that meeting that Carlos was referring to and that Trustee Acerson was at, John Valentine, Commissioner of the Tax, Chairman of the State Tax Commission, raised a question about this and said, can we assume that we're going to get federal funding going forward over the decades to come, that it'll be an increase over what we previously assumed? Anybody's guess is fair there. That's something we can talk about a little bit later. And then, of course, those first 2 bullets, state funding and federal funding, at least, based on the actions in the last few years, both represent increases to the availability of revenue. The next 2 bullets work in the perhaps in the opposite direction. The impact of inflation, increased cost to the baseline costs as we plan ahead, huge impact of inflation. And then how do we project that forward? What are the impacts of inflation over the course of decades to come? And then another critical point is the viability of the motor fuel tax. Utah and UDOT are in many ways leading the nation in identifying an alternative in the road usage charge. How soon can that be implemented? What policy choices does having a road usage charge enable as we go forward? But the point here is that these are all just one short list of some of the key things that are going to be factored into our decision making beyond what the numbers we were just looking at. Okay. Thoughts on any of this, any of these issues? And I'll remind the folks that are online, hopefully you're tracking here and you are more than welcome to ask comments or make comments or ask questions as well, please.
Is it possible for me to retire before the doom comes?
No.
Oh.
That motion dies for lack of a second.
I'd ask the question, maybe Carlos can weigh in on this. Was it your impression in that meeting that from the legislative point of view, the viability of the motor fuel tax, they feel like they were in a pretty good position on that? It seemed like they were trying to say that.
What we've been telling the legislature is we think the motor fuel tax is viable for the next 10, 15 years, but it's going to be transitioning. You're going to see a dramatic change if you were to look at we've had almost a linear increase in electric vehicle purchases in the state of Utah. By 2025, that's going to turn into more of an exponential shaped curve on the rate of manufacturers making them available and adoption. So we're going to see that start to accelerate. And that's why they felt they've made the decisions on gas tax. Still going to carry us for the next 10, 15 years, but we need to ramp up the road usage charge program so that we're ready and we can transition over. Because I believe it's going to be you look at your fleet. I mean, vehicles, my truck is 17 years old, still works. I'm probably not going to buy another one for quite a while. I'm not in that, I'm going to be one of those older vehicles in the fleet.
You're not on the cutting edge is what you're saying.
Not on my vehicles. My
Okay.
phone is close.
I wonder, I'm interested to hear particularly from the local governments. We have Commissioner Frohr and Commissioner Stevenson here, and then also from our cities around the region and state, what you're experiencing in terms of the inflationary impact, how that's affecting your ability to carry out your own capital programs, and are you worried about it? Commissioner Frohr, I saw you turned on. You want to comment?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. Well, our main impact, obviously, I think it's not unlike a lot of other counties and cities. The inflation dealing with personnel, we're constantly battling in the transfer of people from one municipality to other based on increased or promised wages is probably our hugest, our biggest issue we have right now. That's the inflation. Obviously, we see that with capital projects. We've been very lucky to set money aside, both ARPA funding and some other funding for capital projects at the same time, because of the amount of federal dollars out there. As we all know, projects are and contractors that are qualified are very hard to come by because they're booked out 2 or 3 years in advance. So I think that the inflation on projects and the availability of qualified contractors is going to be the issue that we see over the next 2 or 3 years. And quite frankly, the amount of money, the huge amount of money we see out there is probably creating that issue rather than help solve it. And I think that we see that across the state. Looking at it from the Economic Opportunity Commission, and the fellow members on that commission, I think would agree that we see that across the state of Utah.
I'll note Mayor, Commissioner Frohr serves as a member of the Economic Opportunity Commission on behalf of the Utah Association of Counties, and Mayor Ramsey serves as a member on behalf of the Utah League of Cities and Towns. By the way, Mayor Ramsey apologized for not being here. She's at her son's graduation right now. That's a good excuse. Mayor Silvestrini, I think you want to comment, and then maybe we can see if Mayor Cox or Mayor Berube wants to weigh in on this inflationary impacts as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all facing it. You know, we're seeing either bids coming in much higher than we anticipated, or and the price of materials is escalated even on projects that are out with respect. It's difficult to get concrete. It's difficult to get asphalt. And our city had a project that we got funding through this organization where we didn't even get any bids. Okay, I mean, people are sufficiently busy, and this was a project that was tied to a school area, so we did put some parameters on completion dates to get it done before the school year started. We got 0 bids, so now you're having to look at giving the construction industry carte blanche really about completion and how long the project can go. We're finding we're more successful when we don't put those parameters on. That's what we're finding.
Mayor Cox or Mayor Berube?
This is Mayor Berube. We're experiencing many of the same things. Fortunately, our engineers overestimated, so cost-wise, we've been in fairly decent shape, but materials and labor are the same. I should say I had quite a lengthy conversation with President Adams a while back. He feels like once the airport's done and the prison is done, he thinks that the inflationary and availability of materials will subside. He thinks in the next year or two that things will improve. Yet to be seen, but yeah, it's putting a lot of pressure. Inflation's putting a lot of pressure on our ability to do capital projects.
This is Brian Cox. Much like everybody else, we're experiencing the same thing. We've got a major project that we're leaning into, and we're finding that a lot of contractors are wanting to build into the contract on their bid a 25% possible variability due to inflation. And that's a big moving target to try and nail down when you're looking at funding. Is that 25% in wages, 25% in materials? And the answer is yes. So it's given that, as you said, the other mayor, carte blanche on these contractors to be able to charge. And it makes it very difficult to budget on that kind of a moving target.
They have to be making almost as much as police officers these days.
Commissioner Stevenson?
You know, I believe everything everyone said is we're all facing some of these same things. I mean, the supply chain is really basically killing all of us as far as it goes, no matter what type of project we're doing. But I think that one of the things that we have to be really concerned about dealing with this inflation is where's this going to take things? Because many times what the federal government tries to do is take us into a recession. And when we hit a recession, then all of a sudden we start to have the opposite effect as far as revenue being available and what we're able to do as far as it goes. And as hard as it can be to try to slow inflation down, we all have to remember back about 10 or 12 years ago with how hard it was to try to get the economy going back again. And hopefully through this process over the next couple of years, they'll be able to do a leveling effect on this, not turn around and have a deep dive. And I think as far as we're concerned at Davis County, one of the things we're trying to look at is how can we basically, in a sense, become inflation proof? And by saying that, we want to try to make sure we can avoid any type of tax increases, because once revenue starts to run short because costs are so high, you have to turn around and increase taxes to be able to, run the organization. And I think that's where all of us throughout the state, whatever level of government we are, have got to figure out how we can basically try to inflation proof, our own economies within our organizations, so that we're not turning around and having to raise taxes, because all that does is add to the problems and everything else. So.
You should give Jerome Powell, the Fed chair, a call and give him some advice about how to handle the current economy.
Well, but and Andrew, and again, I don't have the advice as far as that goes to him, but I do think that one of the things that is we're talking about, with our economic side in the county, is that we need to continue to figure out how we can drive jobs into the market to keep people there. But part of that, with what we have to do, goes back to the transportation, as we were talking about, is that we've got to, make Davis County become more of a jobs market, more of a opportunity for work there to create office areas and bring companies into it, so that we're keeping people off the streets, so that as we double in size, they're able to walk or take a bus or a train to it. And I think at the same time, as we're able to build that economy, it does kind of help, level off that inflation factor that can affect, local governments. So.
Yeah. Mayor Gale, from the Morgan perspective, or Commission Member or Council Member McCall from Tooele, do you want to weigh in on what you're seeing in your areas? You experiencing similar pressures?
Yeah, we're on the east side of the Wasatch Front, so it's a different situation in a lot of areas, but we have a bridge project that we've had in planning now for 10 years. And we budgeted, because we're a population that is probably like a neighborhood down here. But we've been in the process of planning it, and we came up with a $2.5 million bill. But we're beginning to start it next year at a $5.5 million bill. So it's more than doubled. And with a neighborhood population, it's a little bit difficult. I go back on the, and I'm trying to look behind and learn from things, but what can we do to stop the inflation? What can we do to stand up against some of the trends that are going on? And that's the interesting, I hate to call it fight, but that's the interesting angle to take to try to resolve a lot of this stuff before it gets here. Now we're proposed to double in 5 years in the city.
Your population?
Yeah. And it's really never going to be an industry town. It's a commute town. It's a bedroom village, so to speak, which in a lot of ways that's never going to change. So all I'm saying is first, before I even started, I wanted to compliment what they're doing on 89. That has been an incredible journey. It's actually faster now under construction than it was when it was normal. So I just wanted to compliment whomever is responsible for that.
Carlos.
No, but thank you. It's an amazing team.
Oh, it's been incredible. It's been awesome.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because we just sent out a press release indicating that we're going to have some major impacts because of cement supply. We cannot get the cement when we need it, and suppliers are not being responsive. And so there will be an impact when we pour a couple bridges coming up here real soon. So sorry about that.
Understand. No, just that I'm just small. We have our own individual little needs. We could really use a second exit. That exit that runs into the railroad tracks, 25 feet away from when you come off the freeways. We're now overgrown it, but we also have an obstacle with that railroad running right there. It's kind of hard to work around, but
I'll just note in what the mayor is saying, and then go to Council Member McCall and then Trustee Holbrook. In your comments, you've said your population is going to double. The cost of your projects is near doubling. Oh, and there's other projects that you need, right? And that's just in one, as you've said, small city, and you can apply that to the entirety of the state. These are the challenges that we confront. And I'll just say to everybody, as we look ahead on thinking about the entire state over the course of the decades from now to 2050, these are the impacts that we're trying to understand and project so that we can have a sense of where we're headed together as in the aggregate as we look out ahead of what the revenues are that we need to address these issues. So thank you.
just thanks for the opportunity to be here and
Yeah.
speak my little village piece.
Councilmember McCall.
Just make sure that when those people are coming down Weber County, they turn south instead of north to go to work. That's what we want them doing. So
We're actually just trying to get them to exit. We do have a rumor of a fast food chain coming. So we can get a little bit of this road money. Everybody said Chick-fil-A, but it's not.
Yeah, our situation, where he mentioned something a minute ago in regards to traffic. And if you haven't experienced a backup, come to 12 around 3:30, 4 o'clock on 36 from the interstate, you will experience a backup. And I know that's down the road, but we bidded and planned for a police department, a building, and we had budgeted $4 million for it. And this was a couple of years ago. When it was commissioned, it was 8.5, close to 9. And this again was a couple of years ago. At the same time, we need a new fire station, and we did the paperwork for the fire station preliminary, and it was coming in at about 4 or 5. And now it's 10 or 11. We already know that's about what it's going to cost for a fire station. Everything has gone through the roof, and we are experiencing the same thing everyone else is experiencing with getting contractors to bid. And when they bid, the bids are just totally outrageous. And there's really not a lot you can do to counter that, other than just try to plow through. And because of things that have happened in the past, we got behind on some things, but now we're moving forward, and we're just taking a piece at a time, because that's about the only way I think you're going to be able to get out of this mess, is just do one thing at a time and bid for it. If you get someone to help you, you do. If you don't, you just gotta set the money aside and don't spend it on something else, because you're gonna need more to make it happen. But other than that, I really don't. We're just doing the same thing everybody else does, basically, and it's just a daggone shame that a 12-inch pipe, water pipe, is over $200 basically a square foot. That's just sad, and we need that to fix wells. Unlike you guys, we still run off of wells in Tualatin County. And that is another thing. It's used to be close to $1 million to dig a well. Now it's close to $2 million. It's just a shame.
Thank you, Commissioner or Trustee Holbrook.
Thanks, Andrew. That was an interesting segue that I ended up talking after Councilmember McCall, because this morning I was at a Utah Association of Special Districts meeting, and the special districts are encompassing the sewer, water, fire, et cetera, and smaller entities, mosquito abatement, although Salt Lake is large, there's not a lot of others that are quite that large. And candidly, one of the biggest discussions that every single one of these entities came back to is that all roads lead back to water. water is this infrastructure element that is really encompassing all of us in terms of what we're looking at when we're looking at transportation, when we're looking at all of these other things as well, because we have to figure out strategies to navigate what we anticipate will be a prolonged drought type of format. And so I think when we look at these things, there are multiple layers as we try to look at this, and yet how can we stay focused? How can we move forward in all of these elements? So I just wanted to point that out because those smaller entities are really just seeing so much impact on one thing that I think Councilmember McCall mentioned it. It's the smaller communities that really feel these large exponential impacts. So
It is interesting that whether you're a small city or whether you're a major state agency, there are similar effects being felt. We're all in this together. Let's thank you. Let's bring this back to the Unified Transportation Plan. And now, what you now have on your screen is, given all this backdrop, these are a set of key questions, key funding questions that we've been thinking about and that need to be addressed as we develop the next version of the Utah's Unified Transportation Plan. And this reflects some brainstorming that Carlos and I have done, and working with our teams and working with UTA and MAG and other partners. These are the kind of questions we need to answer. So the TIF, the Transportation Investment Fund, plus the recent one-time funding, is that sufficient for the state road capacity investments? Is it sufficient? Perhaps, but it needs to keep coming. And the Unified Transportation Plan assumes that it will to meet the needs. What about transit needs, both capacity and then operations and maintenance? How much are covered by the state funding and the TTIF, and then local sources? What about the viability of permanently establishing free, fair transit, which I'll note the transportation agencies are all working on evaluating right now, those options through a study that Julie is coordinating, but in close collaboration with UTA and MAG and with UDOT. What about additional local option sales taxes? Most of you are aware that there is the 0.20 local option sales tax, county option, that is authorized in law right now, basically on the Wasatch Front, specifically for transit. We have some county friends here. I won't put them on the spot, but is that going to be implemented? And that expires in mid-2023. So if it's not implemented now, legislatively speaking, should that authorization be extended? Anybody can comment. Everybody should comment at any point here, but I'm just going to keep rolling and working through this. Then what about active transportation? Do we have a stable and adequate source of funding for active transportation? Should we have a standalone source of funding for active transportation, or should it be just incorporated and have flexibility within other funding streams? There's different ways to argue that. Carlton, did you want to jump in here?
I was, and it's just a point that I think goes maybe back to the 0.2 and
on transit.
Yeah, on transit. Been some texting, and our staff doesn't actually believe that some of the local transit piece is figured into it, just some of the express and core routes. And so there's other level of local transit that probably isn't even included in our figures. And, assuming that there's a need there, that it's something we at least want to evaluate if we're putting together some new numbers. I just raise it more as a question, certainly not as a criticism.
No, I get it. So you're getting at the question you asked before about the cost of local bus service. And I'm sure I'm confident that to some extent, the cost of operating the system are incorporated into the plan. Maybe what's not incorporated is expansion to service.
Yeah.
So we'll make sure.
Yeah, just
we're
something
dealing
for us
with
to
it.
look at.
Okay. So continuing on here, local needs. So to the city and county officials that are here, to what extent does the BNC, right, the 30% of the state gas tax that goes to local governments, matched with the local option sales taxes that you have the ability to impose, cover your local needs. I mean, I think generally speaking, we've understood that the B&C, which was perhaps years ago intended to cover all of the local maintenance, is not doing that adequately. And what other options are possible? I know that the League of Cities and Towns is really closely tracking the transportation utility fee. And should there be more clear authorization for local communities to do a transportation utility fee? What about a viable time horizon like we talked about for the motor fuel tax and the feasible structure for a schedule for transitioning to the road usage charge? The legislature keeps pushing UDOT really, really hard. Do it sooner. Do it sooner, even though is it fair to say we're doing it as fast, or if not faster than any other state in the nation right now?
By far and away faster than anyone else. And it's still costing us more money to administer than we collect. Not a good business model.
And we'll get there ultimately, but I mean, for the RUC to really achieve its potential, it needs to be implemented not just in Utah, it really needs to be implemented nationally, and it needs to be implemented in a way that enables the use of technology to incorporate, if we want to do things like congestion pricing or tolling through the RUC. Doesn't mean it has to happen, but at least the technology would enable that.
Hey, Andrew?
Yes,
I see on number 3, talking about options of a transportation utility fee. Has the court ruled on that yet in its final ruling?
No, that's still pending in the Utah State Supreme Court about the legality and viability of local governments imposing the transportation utility fee.
And I was just going to wonder, and this question for Carlos, but I'm presuming that we're kind of like holding the road usage charge down to maybe artificially low levels just to get people to sign up for that as an alternative.
Yeah, when we first started it, the commission established the rates at 1.5 cents per mile. And the idea was, and we capped it, we trying to, the marketing, we capped it, said you will, because you would pay a fixed fee if you were not in the RUC program. And so we capped it that you would never pay more, even if you drove more miles, you would never pay more than the fixed fee. So it is an artificial cap on it. Now, most of those vehicles are not driving above that cap. They're, I think just our electric vehicle charging infrastructure is a limiting factor for how much they're being used for longer trips. But that's going to change. This last session, Representative Ward ran a bill to try to provide more motivation for folks to choose to enter into the program. And the legislature changed the price down to a penny a mile. So we were on track to break even in terms of cost to administer versus income coming in by 2023. That's going to be extended now. We're also, because there's very little there's no real developed market right now. We call it the back office operation. We have a back office operation that administers our tolling system, the express lane system out on I-15. That brings in revenue, not a lot, but brings in revenue that stays within the tollway restricted account for just that road for operations and maintenance. But there's not a developed market for road usage charge yet. And that's part of what we're doing is we're trying to get a market developed so that we can get to a point at which everyone's convinced that as they've looked at how do we fund transportation in the future, that this is the model that will best represent you pay for what you use. It's the fairest way to do it. So we're just starting.
I'll just note one policy point on the road usage charge, and that is that as of right now, the revenues that UDOT gets for the road usage charge are not split by the 70-30 for the B&C. Now, that was an intentional decision.
We didn't think the cities and counties wanted to pony up money for the losses. So.
Right. Ultimately, the revenues coming from that program will exceed the costs. And ultimately, if we make a wholesale transition from motor fuel tax to a RUC, that is something that is going to need to be dealt well. It's going to need to be dealt with well in advance so that we don't unintentionally further reduce the revenues that are going to cities and counties. So just wanted to put that on keep that on the radar screen as we go forward. Lenise?
Yeah, thank you. I may be jumping the gun here a little bit. We haven't finished the list, but all of the context to get to this list has been really important, a huge reminder of the importance of all of these are important, right? We need to do all of these. It's more than just one or a handful. And this list reminds me that I feel like some next steps could be, what are the low-hanging fruit? Or I have lots of more questions on unpacking some of them. For example, when it comes to the 0.20, who's imposed it and who hasn't, right? When it comes to the value capture or the PPP, who's imposed HTRZs, who's on deck to impose HTRZs? When it comes to congestion pricing and tolling, right? Like up Big or Little Cottonwood Canyon, I know that had been a conversation. Where are we at in that tolling? And so I think it would be helpful to unpack each of these, and then that would help us have sort of that next step conversation on policy.
Yeah, I agree. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's the challenge of all the work. It's the challenge and the fun of the work that we do here. We have to deal with all of these issues. And then from a policymaking perspective, it's one thing to authorize a tool, the 0.20, and then it's another thing to actually have it be implemented. So I don't know how else to react to that initially right now. But maybe Lenise you noted, I'll finish out the list. Federal funds, formula and discretionary. How can we best leverage them to support our needs? That's actually what we're going to talk about next. And then are there other funding sources to be explored? Value capture, public-private partnerships. I will note, this is an important point for the financial assumptions. Basically, and I'm looking at our teams here who work on this to make sure I get this right. Basically, the Unified Transportation Plan financial assumptions do not assume private sector contribution, with the exception of developers paying for local costs when they do development, right? It doesn't assume, Julie and Jory are conferring, it does not assume significant value capture, tax increment financing, public-private partnerships. Am I basically right? Say again? A little bit of developer funding going for local roads. Yeah. But the question is there a path to significantly enhanced value capture? Is there a path to significant additional public-private partnerships? What's reasonable for us to assume? We have to be, I would say, relatively conservative in our financial assumptions, the work we do, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be working on and exploring these things.
And Andrew, I would suggest that you also have to stay within the realm of, I'll call it, significant figures. You said you were at $100 million or so. And so the question should be, is this something that could bring that level of investment that makes a difference?
Yeah. Sometimes it's easy to that point to make an assumption, to make an optimistic or irrational assumption that, private funding will cover half of the costs, value capture will cover the full cost of building new transit lines. Unlikely. So what's realistic from these possible sources? Okay. And then again, what's a prudent use of debt financing strategies? From a planning perspective, we could just assume a whole bunch of debt, which has the effect of bringing revenue forward into the planning time horizon, and like it gets paid later. Easy to assume, but is that reasonable to assume? That's perhaps not a decision for us to make here, but what is realistic and what can the state absorb?
And I think, Andrew, yourself, Jeff is gone, but Commissioner Forer is on the line. One of our members of our workforce, our work task force, did not react well to that discussion, right?
You mean of the
Representative
UEOC
Schultz.
working group?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's not an appetite at the legislature right now to bond. They very much want to get into the model of pay as you go. So I would suggest we consider debt financing carefully.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing because what is the current appetite for debt? And then do we let the current I'll say, political or financial environment dictate the presumptions we make for 30 years. Typically, what we do is we take a balance of what's happening now and then what has happened historically and try to weigh those out. So it's tricky. Okay. Say that again.
Any assumption of debt will mean we have less money to meet the long-range needs. It
Right,
cost-
because we're paying interest costs.
Exactly. It
Right.
costs, it costs the kids more money. Might make us feel good right now, but
Carlton?
And I was going to say, in our long-term debt profile, we're not really planning on any new debt issuance until, well past 2030. And that really is tied more to, $1 billion tag to replace our light rail vehicles. And so I think from a capital expansion standpoint, it's kind of a limited conversation unless there's, some kind of revenue source a new revenue source you would bond against. Just because, we're trying to stay within a, reasonable limitation there at some point.
Actually, this little conversation about debt is really helpful. I wonder if Commissioner Frohr, who is a member of as Carlos noted, Commissioner Frohr is a member of the UEOC itself. And then Mayor Berube, I might put you on the spot again. Mayor Berube, in addition to being a mayor, has a lifetime in the finance industry. And I guess I wonder what you both might think about, to what extent should we be assuming or planning for the use of debt to finance infrastructure in the decades to come?
So Andrew, this is Commissioner Frohr. I would agree 100% with Carlos. 10 years ago, when I was running IGG and had a somewhat constant relationship with Carlos, then bonding was a little more acceptable. Obviously, we didn't have the size of the state budget that we do now, but it's transitioned over the last several years with the amount of revenue the state's seen. And there really is a mindset currently, obviously that can change. I don't see it changing anytime soon, that debt becomes more amenable to the legislature. But right now, I think it's, and I would also agree that the more debt you put in place, that puts an additional burden on the future generations. And I think we have to be cognizant of that fact. And I think that the legislature, in their wisdom, that's how they view it, is that they'd rather pay today for things that we can enjoy today and not shift that burden downstream.
Yeah, great points. I don't know, Mayor Berube, if you're hearing this conversation, feel free to jump in. I'll say that I know that the agency staff that are here that work on, I see Sean and Julie conferring on this exact issue right now, but from our agencies that work on the financial assumptions, I would say this: we get pressure from communities to get projects into the Unified Transportation Plan. And one of the ways you do that, the availability of revenue is a constraint on what projects can actually go in the plan, as it should be, right? Well, then do we say, well, let's just assume debt, which, again, brings more money in and then gets us more projects on the list on the front end. And when you're dealing with long time horizons, if you assume long-term bonding, the payment of those bonds can occur outside the horizon of the Unified Transportation Plan. So there you go. You spend it in the plan horizon, pay for it outside the plan horizon. And I just think this conversation has been instructive for our teams that are thinking about how much debt should we assume in the plan. We might have to revisit that. And any other thoughts on debt or financing?
yeah, Andrew, if you don't mind, it's gonna be very unpopular, I know, but I have to say it. I think the use of debt in building the plan has not been truthful in what we're doing. We had more money to spend than we anticipated for the first phase of the long range plan, right?
Wait, say that again. We
have received more money than we anticipated in the first phase of the long range plan.
Yeah, you mean actual money.
actual money. We've
Yeah, that
more,
has been
more than we even
appropriated.
anticipated.
Mhm.
But still, we're getting to 20 to 25% of the projects identified in the long range plan. We built this false idea that this first phase is going to be done in the first 10 years. We knew we couldn't get to it. And I think we should be more truthful in how we build this next 4 years.
Can I make just one little comment?
Yeah, wait, Mayor, Commissioner, can you, we go to the Mayor Gale and then come back to you and let you speak into your mic. Okay, Commissioner, go ahead, Mayor Gale.
Could be a chance you're gonna say it anyway, so go ahead first.
Okay, I was just curious on the term truthful. Is it truthful or basically being more realistic?
Realistic.
That's why you're an elected official.
So the billions that we have on the board, is that really free and clear money? Or does that fall into the trillions of dollars of debt that the country's in? They're handing that to us.
Yeah, that's for the most part, almost entirely, the assumed revenue in the Unified Transportation Plan is real. Now we have that presumes that we continue to have a gas tax or equivalent. It presumes that the sales taxes continue to perform. It presumes that federal funding continues to flow. And to some relatively modest extent, again, we're dealing with big numbers here, but to some relatively modest extent, those assumed revenues incorporate the presumption of bonding, okay? But it is not in the way that you're suggesting, it is not like federal deficit spending where such a significant amount of the assumed revenue is coming from not just debt financing, but real deficit financing. That's not where we are. We try to be much more careful and much more realistic about the revenue assumptions.
So are you telling me it's safe money? I mean, $1 trillion is $1,000 a day for 3,000 years.
Yeah,
We're into it 20 something now.
I mean, I don't want to say yes or no, but we're conservative in the approach that we take. So
Right,
it is safe. But just when you get out over the course of 30 years, there is so much uncertainty. This is one of the things that the agencies have all been talking about, is the uncertainty of revenue, let alone technology, over the course of 30 years, particularly as you get out further, the uncertainty grows. But we try to be really careful. And I'll also note, maybe this is important, it's one thing to have a plan for what's going to happen in decades to come. We are continually updating that as we are making real-time decisions on the actual commitment of an expenditure of dollars now. So the planning time horizon allows us to chart a course forward, but then on the actual expenditure of dollars, we have a much more involved processes over the next few years to make decisions about the real commitment of revenue. And we don't spend any money that we don't have, that we know that we can afford. We also don't issue generally any debt at the state level that can't be paid for over a relatively short time period.
Thank you.
So
That's
I think it's safe. Yes, basically.
okay, thanks. That's what these ears need to hear.
Okay.
I'm very, very concerned about the rising generation and what we leave them, what footprint we really do leave them. So I'm thankful to hear we're being responsible.
Yeah. Responsible, but then I'll go back to Carlos, the point that you made, because of all the pressure. I think this is really the issue, the pressure from communities, from transportation agencies, from legislators, from everybody, about we need to get these projects done soon. That pushes us to include as much as we can in the first phase of the Unified Transportation Plan, to say this is needed now, and we're hopeful to get to this now. But it's a balance to strike that you're raising of, are we giving a false assumption about what is realistic to accomplish? That's something that we need to keep working on.
Yeah, so from a capacity perspective, I don't see the ability to add a single project to the first phase of the long range plan that isn't programmed already today. I think it's going to be very difficult to do that. And that's a very unpopular thing to say.
Just a quick question. If by chance, which everybody's saying will happen, we get the Olympics, are there things that we're going to have to adjust for that, or do you feel everything's in
No.
place on that right now?
No, one of the biggest and most important selling points on the Olympics is we're not going to have to add any infrastructure. I met with the International Committee a couple weeks ago, and that is a major point. Now, we're going to have to bring in a lot of transit vehicles because they want to have as a green Olympics. But there's not going to be any investments in roads, bridges, sort of the things we did before the last Olympics. So we can't look at that as a meal ticket.
Okay. Now that we've gotten all these key funding questions figured out, we're going to move on in our agenda. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to focus in on federal funding. And we sort of got three things to hit on: formula funding, discretionary grant funding, and then congressionally directed spending. Now, I'm going to note we intended to have the policy discussion be the bulk of this meeting. It is now 1:05, and we're going to end our meeting by 1:30. So I'm going to ask, and they're anticipating this, UDOT and UTA to share some information with us about the impacts of the federal formula funds on our funding picture. And just for context here, as a reminder, roughly 2/3 of the funding, I'm looking at Miranda, she'll correct me if I'm wrong here, roughly 2/3 of the funding in the 5-year IIJA Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is formula funding that will come to us. We don't have to compete for it. It's formula funding. And that is an increase over previous years of, depending on the program, 15 to 25%. And then the remaining 1/3 is in competitive discretionary grants. So let's start on the formula side, and UTA, UDOT, I'll throw the ball up, a jump ball. Who wants to go first? But you're the tallest one. Carlton.
I can go, and I don't know, Mary, do you want to comment, but feel free to chime in. I will say, as we look at formula funds on this latest round, we're actually taking those into account in our 2023 budget. Remember, we're on a tip calendar fiscal year, so we're in the process of preparing that budget. Those formula funds, which can be used actually for a little wider variety of things, we're taking a conservative approach to those, in the sense that while we want to definitely utilize them, we hate to have them be dependent on our operational side too extensively, because if somehow they got reduced back in a subsequent Congress or a subsequent kind of act, we don't want to be dependent on those from an operational standpoint. But there are a lot of state of good repair projects that were anticipated or hoped for in our 5-year capital plan, and some of these funds could be used toward those projects, which would then free up some local funds for some opportunities. But we'll make those evaluations really over the next about 4 months, maybe 5. And certainly there'll be a lot of opportunity for feedback and review of those efforts. We're anticipating going after whatever grant opportunities that there are. In fact, we're getting ready or close to resubmitting for the Mid-Valley BRT, and a number of these projects fall now under the oversight of UDOT, and we're doing those in coordination with them, or they will be the applicant on some of those projects as the opportunities present themselves. But there are some other projects that are, and we just recently submitted stuff for the low-no bus program, as well as our training center that we're developing that will allow us to do some apprenticeship on our rail side, and also enhance our bus training opportunities, and so there's some grants into there. But there are some great opportunities, at least in the very near future, on the transit side, and so we're going to try to take advantage of many of those as we can. I don't know, Mary, am I missing something big that, or Beth?
No, I think you got most of it. We did though, this year, in anticipation of the formula funds, we did set up a capital project. We called it partnership projects. And I think it was $10 million this year just to help our partners on projects we want to work on together. So
I guess one question. We talked about inflation, formula funds increase and costs increase. So how are you striking that balance? And I guess same question for UDOT.
I will say, in our regard, the saving grace, if you will, and the other thing that has hugely hit us is the price of diesel fuel. And so we budgeted $2.75 a gallon, which was, I think, 25 cents more a gallon than we historically have. But when you're paying $4.50 something a gallon for diesel fuel, and we're one of the actually largest consumers of diesel fuel in the state of Utah, so it's not a passive interaction for us. I think probably the saving grace for us is that sales tax numbers have been as strong as they have, and certainly more than we anticipated. So you know, we're not financially upside down. And as we look beyond our 5-year horizon, though, you know, there are some concerns that we have, but because of some of the past federal funds and some strong sales tax dollars, our 5-year horizon is a much stronger than we anticipated, and we were able to avoid issuing a little over $100 million in debt this year, which had been in our game plan, more out of necessity than and to the point of it would have affected our credit rating. It would have done some other detrimental pieces, and so I think we're in a much better financial picture than I say we were 3 years ago. But those are conservative numbers, and we're, like most people, are anticipating there could be a recession, and in those cases, obviously sales tax would likely fall, and those reserves are hopeful in maybe softening the landing, and maybe not putting us quite as strong of a bind we were in back in 2009.
That's great, Carlton. Thank you. UDOT, Carlos, Ben, Leif.
Ben's gonna bring up that first graphic.
I'll try.
Okay. As Ben brings this up, I'll turn it to him for a little description of it. So this is a graphic that shows the IIJA. So if you look at it, we had estimated about 2021. We're comparing it to the last year of the FAST Act. And then you can see the differences between the IIJA and what we had been operating under in the last federal authorizing bill. If you average up the differences on the far right, it's about a 14% increase that we saw in the formula programs coming to UDOT. The inflation we're seeing right now is well above 14%. So, in the formula programs, we are just hoping to hold what we had initially been planning. When we look at, making assumptions about what the new authorizing bill would look like, we basically project flat. And we don't anticipate an increase. We got an increase. Wow, we got excited. So we're not thinking we're going to see a lot more output or outcomes from those existing formula programs. You can see the 3 new formula programs coming to us: Carbon, Protect, and Bridge. The Bridge is probably the best program in the entire IIJA. We just programmed, Ben, was it like 90 local bridges?
Yeah, there was 90 bridges on a bridge list for the 5-year period. And the win out of this is that this program allows for off-system bridges, locally owned off-system bridges, which that has been a challenge in the past. And it allows for those locally owned off-system bridges to be done with zero local match, which is that's been one of the hangups before. So there's a minimum requirement that 15% of that money goes to those off-system bridges. But I know that the UDOT structures, especially early on in the program, they're targeting the locally owned bridges that they have not, that we as a state have not been able to get to through other ways.
There's a bridge in Morgan that needs to be done, by the way.
But Mayor
To
Gale's
see if it's on the
ears
list.
perked up when bridges, locally owned bridges were mentioned, I'm sure.
Yeah, I told this, I was with a friend of mine, the Secretary of Wisconsin DOT yesterday, and I told him what we were doing. He says, don't tell my locals. So those are the three programs. Then off to the right are new programs to Utah, not necessarily to UDOT. And we anticipate, from what we're seeing now, the EV charging will be coming through the Department of Transportation to UDOT. We're working on putting together the required plan that's due by August 1st. Before we would be authorized to spend any of the money. That was what was in the authorizing bill. I think we're looking at maybe 5 point something or 6 point
Yeah,
something then.
the first year it's closer to 5 million for the EV charging that's available. And then I think it goes up a little bit after the first year.
And then,
Ben, can you zoom in a little bit, please?
sorry about that.
That was your thing.
No, and this sheet that I brought it up because it showed the percentages. This was kind of one of the early ones that
Early working
we
sheet
were
for us.
doing. So yeah, we've since known, they've come out with guidance on the EV charging. It's called the NEVI program, National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure. I think they've since come out with the guidance, and that is through the DOTs, but
And then the broadband, there was legislation creating a legislative task force, basically a broadband committee. So they're going to be making decisions at a statewide level in terms of how to use any broadband money, both appropriated at the state level or the federal money coming in. The other monies are really being coordinated through the governor's office of planning and budget right now. Now, we also wanted to show the different grant programs here, or are you going to switch over to the grants that we're tracking? Just maybe bring.
yeah, let's see if I can do this without.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is on our webpage on the
Yep,
commission.
on the
web-
commission page. Yeah, there's a couple big ones that have came out, and due dates have come with, specifically the RAISE grant. I know that we've got the ones listed here. So UDOT is pursuing a RAISE grant, and then there's some other entities that UTA and High Valley Transit also have RAISE grant submissions that have some nexus with. This is what we show at the commission. So there's some UDOT nexus on these. I know that there were other entities that submitted RAISE grants that for the purposes of this sheet, they're not shown here. And then the other large one, and I gotta move my windows here on my computer to get there. This one was a new approach that they've done this go around, is they released what they called a multimodal project discretionary grant opportunity, which encompassed 3 different grant programs. So it was the mega grant, the infra grant, and the rural grant. And you could submit on that. You could submit an application on that one and be considered, depending on your eligibility, you could be considered for all 3 if it met. So it was kind of one application for all 3. So, UDOT did submit on that one. We were hoping to submit in coordination with UTA on the front runner project, but there was a late clarification in the notice, and that was not eligible. So we'll look for other opportunities there. But some other ones that are on this sheet, the Scenic Byways program, there's a grant opportunity out there, and that all has to get coordinated through the Scenic Byways Committee and prioritized. It's all in the guidance. And then I'll just mention the one that's not on this list because UDOT is not an eligible entity, is the Safe Streets for All. And that's one that's out on the street now for MPOs, local entities are all eligible. I guess on that one, I am part of the group with GOPB that tries to coordinate and be aware of all the different transportation related grants. So I would just hope if people are interested in that one and are pursuing, maybe get the word up through like MPOs and stuff like that, and we'll try to coordinate and just understand what everybody's going after. So if there's ways to coordinate or make sure that there were not overlapping requests, that would be ideal on that one.
Ben, thank you very much. Just a few things in response to that. First, specifically on the Safe Streets for All grant program. Coincidentally, just yesterday, all of the MPOs around the state, all 4 MPOs and FHWA had a meeting to talk about that program. There is already a highway safety plan. And the goal of the Safe Streets for All is to have more locally focused safety plans. In order to get capital, in order for a community to get capital funding under that program, first there needs to be an adopted safety action plan. And so we're at least in our area, we're working towards submitting a grant application to get funding in first year to develop the required action plan, which would then, once that's adopted, qualify us in the next year's, not just us, but our community specifically, to apply for funding under this grant program. So Ben, thank you for targeting that. You want to make a comment about this
I
specifically?
do, thank you. I just know Meg is doing the exact same. That's exactly what we're looking at.
That's awesome. We're working together on that. So that's great. Carlton?
One other thing I was going to just add is that, once Front Runner and those, some of those projects are done, the follow-up that we have to have are operational funds, because there would be additional service. So when we look at these formula funds, it actually brings an opportunity for us, because before that was a difficult nut to crack. And as been pointed out in the 5600 West Express, which is critical for the Mountain View corridor next phase to be able to commence, having the operational funds for that again will be very helpful in the midterm horizon.
That's great. Lots of information is available about the federal funds. We've sent, Miranda sent information out to folks in our area. Ben's doing a great job coordinating on with GOPB, as he noted. Laura Hansen, our friend, Laura Hansen, is coordinating these activities for GOPB, and Ben is helping coordinate that for transportation. So I guess here's one thought, and maybe I'll use this as a way to transition to Ryan Levitt. We could all just sort of go free for all and everybody applies for everything. Generally speaking, I think it is helpful to coordinate with each other, which does not mean that any one entity gets to dictate what another entity applies for, but maybe it's just a general principle. I'll throw this out and see what people think. The better we can be, if we can coordinate with each other about what our priorities are as a state, then that is to the benefit of our delegation in supporting our priorities. And then also, these are discretionary and competitive grants that USDOT reviews. They're going to consider geographic equity, if you will, across states. So we'll do better if we coordinate on what our priorities are as a state. So I don't know, I see people nodding their heads. Ryan Levitt, you can, if you're willing, you can comment on that, and then also transition into giving us some info about where we ended up with our members of our delegation on congressionally directed spending.
Perfect. So thanks again for having me here. I would say on the discretionary grant programs, typically the federal agencies want to see regional impact and strong local support. Those are important components for a grant application to compete well. So I think the thought to have a regionally coordinated strategy, or even a statewide coordinated strategy, is a very, I think, prudent way to move forward on looking at discretionary grant programs. Talking about the congressionally directed spending, or community project funding, or earmarks, there's different names. So in the House, they call them community project funding. In the Senate, they still call them congressionally directed spending. But colloquially, they're earmarks. And I think everybody on this call probably has a pretty good sense of where we've been in the past with earmarks. And we had a 10-year break, and then we're right now in the second year of Congress after a 10-year break accepting earmark requests and or congressionally directed spending requests. And in Utah, our 4 House members have been happy to participate in this program. and our two senators have pledged not to participate in the earmarking process. And so really the work has been done on the House side when it comes to congressional directed spending. And most of the projects that have been submitted by our members of Congress have been transportation related. I would say the lion's share. And when it comes to getting a project to compete well, I think it's important to understand what an earmark is not. So, if you have a large capital project that's going to cost you, tens or 20s or 30s, hundreds of millions of dollars, an earmark is really not going to be a great way to finance that project. It's a small piece, typically somewhere between $500,000 and maybe up to $5 million is sort of the sweet spot on getting one of these congressionally directed appropriations. And what it can do is be an excellent vehicle to help your project move forward. You can use that money for design, engineering, environmental, studies and the like. But what it's not going to do is basically, if you have a very large project, it's not going to pay for the lion's share of that. Most of these projects, the way you look at an earmark is you take these discretionary programs. These are the accounts that generally you're eligible to get a direct appropriation out of. And so typically you have to follow the same rules that those discretionary programs outline, which largely includes a local cost share. So it's important to recognize that you can go after this money, but you have to have some local contribution as well. The other thing is our House members are anxious to try to help as many people as they can in this space, but they're limited by the committees. They can only, the first year go around, they were able to submit 10 per office. Now they're able to submit up to 15 is what they did this year. I've spoken with many of the offices to try to get a projection. Will there be an opportunity to do this next year if the House, has new majority? And the thought is that there likely will be an opportunity next year to do this again. And so, it's an interesting avenue for people to think about in terms of trying to be part of their overall federal funding strategy. If it's a smaller project, you can get a good chunk of federal dollars this way. An important thing to think about when you're competing for these is you have to demonstrate very strong local support. Typically in the transportation space, the Appropriations Committee puts out guidance. One of the guidance pieces that they want to see that the project is listed in some sort of a state or regional plan. They don't want this to be something that's just, something that's just been concocted, sort of shooting from the hip. They want this to be part of a regional or a state transportation plan. And so, that's the way I would think about it. I don't know, Andrew, if there's other thoughts you want me to touch on, or if others have questions about this area. I would say that, our House members, each of them largely submitted transportation as a lion's share of their projects that they submit to the committee. And all of those projects have to be listed on their website per the new instructions for earmarking. And so you can go to any one of the House members' offices and they list all the projects that they submitted. You can see them there. It's all very transparent.
Ryan, thank you. I want to give Myron Lee from Dixie an opportunity. He had actually specifically suggested we have an update on this. So I don't know, Myron, if you're there, you can comment. There he is. And then Jeff Gilbert, our partner up in Cache Valley, see if you, as we're sort of closing out here, I'll just sort of ask around if anybody has any concluding comments they want to make here. Myron.
I appreciate the time, Andrew. The reason I wanted to have a discussion on congressionally directed spending is because to some of the smaller communities, that those smaller projects, even though they're $500,000 to $5 million projects, those projects have a huge impact on being able to meet our local goals of building and creating transportation systems that and projects that didn't exist before. And I would just point out one project down here, and I I'm not advocating for that project necessarily, but just as an example of a project, Purgatory Road is a regionally significant road that would go between State Route 9 and State Route 7 through an area that has jurisdiction under Washington County, Washington City, and Hurricane City. There's a lot of partners and we all want the road, but we can't figure out an easy way to fund it or to get to funding. And so this gave us a way to try to reach out and get funding. There are several other projects that were submitted for that funding, but sometimes those smaller funding packages are the only ones that we can equitably reach out for and get and then be able to build projects.
Understood. Thank you very much, Myron. Okay, Jeff, did you want to add anything here?
Nothing really to add. We're just trying to get our head around the new normal of these earmarks and figure out what our potential is. But I appreciate the information.
Okay.
And I would just add one more thing, Andrew, sorry. You know, in terms of the earmarks go along with the appropriation cycle. So basically the window has closed for fiscal year 23, which starts at the October 1st. And so really the next opportunity for a local, you know, a community or to go after this kind of funding, federal funding, is going to be next spring. That's going to be the next opportunity. And so, you know, you'll want to start gearing up well ahead of that to be prepared.
Thanks. Good advice, Ryan. Okay, everybody, we have come to the end of our time. Thanks so much for the really good discussion on these issues. I will note, looking ahead, so JPAC typically has 4 meetings per year. Our next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, September 1st. We could do a field trip. The nice thing about having Zoom is that people can be anywhere and everybody can participate. So the question is, do we want to do a field trip somewhere? Carlton's saying yes. You know, Carlton likes field trips. Field trip, it's a you know, fact gathering effort, right? To learn more about needs around the state. So this could be something we could, let's see, September. Gosh, September is a great time to go just about anywhere in Utah, isn't it? We're so lucky to live here. We can put some ideas together. Typically, we've, you know, Myron, we've come down to St. George. Maybe, I don't know, maybe September's, you know, we should think about December for St. George. I don't know. Jeff, we've gone up to Cache Valley. I don't know if anybody wants to throw any ideas out now, or if people are generally open to having a field trip component. It seems like people are saying yes, then we'll do a little work on that possibility. Any thoughts about that? No?
I always find it helpful to see what's happening in other parts of the state. So I look forward to it.
Yeah, maybe we could, if we do a field trip somewhere, we could make it a multimodal evaluation. Okay, and any other thoughts before we wrap our meeting here?
You wouldn't be disappointed in Morgan.
Certainly not.
September's beautiful there.
Okay, can I have a motion to adjourn? And a second. That is not debatable. We stand adjourned. Thank you, everybody.